they were managing things very poorly. They were expecting to be bailed out by the Gulf and by the United States. They were not. And I believe 5 or 6 years later, much of the Lebanese population is still waiting to get their deposits back.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I am Murray, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics is Robert Morris. How are you this time?
I'm all right. I'm a bit chagrined, Rory, I'll be honest.
Why? What's happened?
I feel like I've been very wrong about Syria, and that is a strange feeling. I feel like perhaps not the most modest thing to say, but Rory, I feel like I'm often right, and I feel like I've been very wrong at least twice this fall. Maybe it's about middle age, and I'm losing my powers. I don't know.
Or is it maybe one of the most complex situations on Earth, and there are so many factors that you couldn't even understand if you're on the ground?
No excuse, Rory. No excuse. I want to be right about everything, and I was wrong about Kamala Harris winning, and I was wrong about rebels in Idlib, the Syrian rebels in Idlib, who are
you were more optimistic with the election,
perhaps
when Idlib is a very different thing.
Idlib is a very different thing, and I looked at it very closely for like much of a decade. I hadn't looked at it very much in the past 5 years. For those who are not aware, the Syrian war, which had the character of a frozen conflict for half a decade at this point, unfroze very dramatically for some very concrete reasons. First off, Israel's destruction of Hezbollah, a Lebanese militia we'll probably be talking about a lot today, was at the center of Assad's survival strategy. This is the Assad regime, the Syrian government. Number two would probably be brutal country-killing U.S. sanctions that have been maintained essentially after Assad won the war. The United States brought the boom of sanctions down and made sure that no recovery was possible. And then number three would be the ongoing dynamic of Russia's distraction in Ukraine. But all three of these together have coincided in making a faction that I used to have a lot of contempt for, the jihadists of Syria, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, with a group that has barely distanced itself from al-Qaeda, was not particularly impressive throughout much of the Syrian civil war, has apparently reformulated itself in a very serious way and has been able to take advantage of those three conditions that I mentioned to, as of the time of recording, take over dramatically more of Syria in the course of a week than every differing rebel faction had managed over the past 12 years. It's a really extraordinary development.
Because I did what you told me to do, which is to check the population centers, because quite often we see, it looks like they've taken over the entire country, but they just have a lot of desert that nobody lives in. And as soon as they meet an actual population, they get annihilated. But they do seem to be getting, is it the third largest city? They're possibly in the process of taking?
Oh, I think they're in the process of taking the third, and they took number two.
Editing Rory here. Since we've recorded this episode, the rebels have taken over the entire country, including the Syrian Transitional Government, the Autonomous Administration of Northern and Eastern Syria, Syrian Interim Government, Syrian Free Army, Southern Operations Room, as well as other smaller factions and governments. And Assad has fled to Russia. Here's hoping that Syria has a peaceful and happy future.
That is something I mentioned that in a live chat this past week. Normally, it's like, let's see where people live, and then we can see how dramatic this narrative is. By that rubric, this is still a very dramatic narrative. Most of the population of Syria lives either on the coast or on the border of Lebanon in a strip going from Aleppo down to Damascus, which is sort of nestled at the bottom of the country. Honestly, as we're talking, Rory, they could be taking, I think it's fair to say they've already taken half of that populated strip of Syria. Nobody seems to dispute that they have taken Aleppo, they have taken Hama, and I think they are currently contesting Homs, which I think might be the third biggest city. The biggest city, Damascus, is where Assad and the Syrian government regime will make their last stand. But we're recording this on a Friday, and this isn't going to go up until a week from Monday. So it's entirely possible that Assad will have fallen, Damascus will have fallen, and we have a completely new government in the Middle East.
But is it also because Iran's distracted as well with Israel? Like, is it
Absolutely.
Israel? Is this what has sort of caused everything to fall apart?
Absolutely. And specifically, militia in Lebanon called Hezbollah that has been a thorn in the side of Israel since its formation in the mid 1980s, a group called terrorists by the U.S. government. Interestingly, also, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the organization that is currently overthrowing Assad and is very much oriented against Hezbollah and Iran and is the current, or at least as of the time of recording, Syrian government, is also designated by the U.S. government as terrorists. But Hezbollah has been at different times in its evolution seen as heroes worldwide, seen as terrorists, certainly by the wealthiest and most powerful countries.
And they're almost like a weird state within a state because there is like the Lebanese army proper, but then they also have this weird second army that's mostly backed by Iran.
Yes, and this is what I want to get into over the course of today. I think because the Syrian developments are going to change so much between our recording and the broadcast
Oh
of
yeah,
this
yeah.
episode, I think there's not much point in saying much more than we've already said, but I think there is a point in delving a little more deeply into the relationship between Lebanon and Syria. There's a reason why this militia, this Iranian-supported militia, and I say that very strongly. This is as distinct from the Houthis who get some money and some weapons from Iran. The Hezbollah is in its founding documents says we obey the supreme leader of Iran. I mean, this is very much an Iranian-backed, supported, created to a degree militia in Lebanon. That there's a reason why the relationship, why that militia that had mostly been about fighting off Israeli invasions of Lebanon decided to become the main support of the Assad regime in Syria next door. So I think we're going to talk today a little bit more about the history of Lebanon specifically
Mm-hmm.
and how Hezbollah developed in this situation. The reason why Lebanon itself is so strange is what we want to unpack today. And then that will sort of, I think, help to explain why Hezbollah is so strange. Lebanon, from the outset, has been set up as kind of a spoiler country. The point of the Lebanon, as it was initially set up, was to be a problem for the Ottoman Empire. And then when it became successively a French colonial territory and then an independent country, it continued to exist as a spoiler country to sort of screw over the Arab world more broadly. First the French in a post-colonial era, and then the United States to sort of continue screwing over the Arab world. The interesting thing about the way that Lebanon developed, and was essentially what Hezbollah is that Iran figured out how to sort of turn the tables on the United States and Israel by taking that strange character of Lebanon and sort of flipping it around,
Mm-hmm.
working with a very put upon and oppressed sector of the Lebanese population. So I guess the first thing to say and emphasize, as is always worth emphasizing, is just how ridiculous it is that we're going to spend an hour talking about a country with a population of 5 million. It is a tiny place.
Well, we did something similar last time with the United Arab Emirates.
True enough. That's fair. But Lebanon is not actually a particularly wealthy place. It has historically.
Yes, it's been incredibly poor in recent years. It's like 80% of the population is under the poverty level.
Yeah. And because of its spoiler nature, because of the way that it is intentionally created as a cockpit of complicated politics, Lebanon actually was for a period of time quite wealthy. It's actually a 2019 financial crisis that sort of ripped a lot of Lebanese out of the middle class and, created it. You said it's 80% is below the poverty line in Lebanon
Yeah.
now. There were always atrociously poor Lebanese people, specifically, not exclusively, but the Shia population out of which Hezbollah came was traditionally very economically put upon. But Lebanon, up until that 2019 financial crisis, had great sources of wealth. It was a international center of banking. A lot of the Gulf Arabs stored a lot of their oil wealth in
Didn't they
Lebanon.
have like a 10% interest rate if you give them dollars, something like that? They had a sort of like a make money fast scheme.
So I did not bone up on the particulars of the 2019 financial crisis, but my understanding is that the central bank essentially, it's been described as a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah.
The central bank was doing something idiotic with dollars. I can't speak to the details, but they were managing things very poorly. They were expecting to be bailed out by the Gulf and by the United States. They were not. And I believe 5 or 6 years later, much of the Lebanese population is still waiting to get their deposits back from their banks. It is a really horrible situation that the Lebanese now find themselves in. And I think over the course of this episode, I'm going to be a little bit dismissive of Lebanon as a project initially. It is one of those things that was sort of designed to fail, but I don't want to come across as unsympathetic to the very real plight of the 5 million Lebanese people who it is overdone, to say the least. But truly, in like the 1950s, 1960s, this was the, what do they call it, the Paris of the East or what have you. It was a kind of a glamorous.
Was this a place the French had a great particular romance for, something they sort of fell in love with?
Absolutely. Beirut is still today, in fact, a great party city. But before the cavalcade of catastrophes that we're going to describe today, it was a place that was seen as very Western-oriented, prosperous, and happy. That was, I think, always a little bit exaggerated. It was a place that was already kind of doomed on a number of levels. I think it's very important, this 5 million people, very important for the larger question of its neighbors. Iran has figured out how to make Lebanon, and actors before Iran figured out how to make Lebanon a real pain for Israel, which is directly to Lebanon's south on the Mediterranean coast, for Syria itself. I mean, Lebanon is a traditional, historic part of Syria. It was carved out of Syria for a reason, which we're about to get to.
When did Iran start using it as a sort of proxy to annoy Israel?
Well, the start would be 1979. I'd like to go back a lot further than that, but I guess it comes down to the communal factions that make up Lebanon, and let's try to briefly do that history, and then we'll get to 1979 and the birth of Hezbollah. I had this formulation that I came up with this morning, Rory, that is guaranteed to piss everybody off.
Okay, well, that's good. At least you're
Yes.
treating everyone equal.
I would argue that Lebanon, in its origins, is kind of a less successful proto-Israel. That is what Lebanon is. That's why Lebanon exists. That's what France was trying to do, and that is what the United States attempted thereafter. I think it was in part less successful because it was actually based on real indigenous elements, whereas Israel was, take a bunch of highly educated Europeans and the historic commercial elites overstates it, but historic commercial classes of the entire Mediterranean, folks of the Jewish faith, dump them in one country. That's obviously going to be a little bit more successful. What France did with international partnership, even before France controlled Lebanon, was to create a Christian enclave in Lebanon. That is the initial purpose of Lebanon, to take a indigenous Christian population. I believe that they lived on an actual Mount Lebanon.
Okay.
And actually, I didn't get too into the geography. There are a couple mountains in Lebanon. The Christian there was a Christian population that had survived for, I suppose, literally millennia.
It's like an ancient form of Christianity, isn't it?
Maronite Christianity is, I think, yes, has some elements that are different. I did not dive into the theology. It's important to point out there are very different sorts of Christian, even within this country of 5 million, within the Christian population of 1 to 2 million. I'm sure the Christians would argue it's 2.5 to 3 million, but what have you. Like, there's a bewildering differentiation of sects. There is an indigenous Christian population that I believe it's the Maronites. I'm not sure what their affiliation with the Catholic Church is, I did not get into the theology for this episode, Rory. I apologize.
That's okay.
I mean, there's Armenian Orthodox, there are Greek Orthodox, there are Maronites, there are a lot of Christian populations in Lebanon that are like Protestants because the British and the Americans poured tons of money into proselytizing their version of
Okay.
Christianity over 150 years. So, and I think that's the key point here is that this doesn't just go back to French's period of imperialism. The Lebanon area was a focus of European and, yes, American. I believe the premier university in Lebanon is the American University in Beirut,
Okay.
AUB, which isn't now, but at its initiation was a Protestant proselytizing university. But yeah, so this goes back to the middle of the 1800s when Europe was obviously, I mean, not obviously, but I mean, I think most people know that Europe in the 1800s was sort of riding roughshod over most of the earth. The Ottoman Empire was preserved mostly because the British didn't want the Russians and the French to take it. But the Russians, the French, and the British, when they weren't fighting over how the Holy Land was being treated, I mean, one of the biggest wars of the 19th century, the Crimean War, with the French and British on one side and the Russians on the other, had part of its genesis in who's pushing around the Ottomans more as of treatment of the Holy Land. And Mount Lebanon was part of this. So even before the Ottoman Empire lost this territory at the end of World War I, in the 1860s, specifically 1861, French and other international pressure forced the Ottomans to create a separate vilayet, which is, I guess, the province in that term, of the Ottoman Empire that was led by a Christian because there was intercommunal violence even back then. So Mount Lebanon became this sort of, or the Lebanon vilayet became this, one of many sort of breaches in Ottoman sovereignty. And the point of this was to, have another lever with which to push around the Ottoman Empire. And that is what Lebanon was. In the aftermath of World War I, France took over Syria and Lebanon more broadly. And throughout this period, from 1861 up until Lebanese independence in 1943, you had this dynamic that was present throughout the Ottoman Empire, which is that Christian communities tended to do better because Christian communities had more natural access to educational resources that Americans and Europeans wanted to provide, had traditional religious affinities, any number of easy ways to become sort of more commercially involved and more wealthy within the declining Ottoman Empire. So even before the French took over Mount Lebanon, I'm not entirely certain whether Beirut was part of Mount Lebanon, but it was certainly part of the Lebanon Vilayet. I'm not entirely certain. But Beirut was a flourishing commercial city with a lot of Christian influence. And that did create a real, at least a higher middle class, a wealthy group of Christians in Lebanon that were well positioned to take advantage of the many privileges that the French wanted to provide when they took over Syria. When the French knew they could see the writing on the wall, it was time, we're eventually going to have to give this up, at least theoretically, in the aftermath of World War I. The Syria wasn't a colony, it was a mandate. It was intentionally, supposedly, from the beginning, this was meant to be a temporary thing. So I believe from the beginning, the French set up a higher degree of autonomy for Lebanon, perhaps with an eye towards it being a separate country. I'm not sure exactly how that developed, if the French intended that from the beginning, or if that's sort of how it ended up as a result of a lot of very obvious processes that the French had started. The concern was that Mount Lebanon itself, one of the concerns was that Mount Lebanon itself, this sort of Christian area, I think there are also Druze populations and other populations on Mount Lebanon itself, like it was a concern of the French planners that, we really want to set up an independent state that's going to be independent from Syria, is therefore going to be a real problem for everybody who wants to set up anything around this. But we want it to be viable. It has to be like an actual country. Like it has to be able to have some degree of independence. I mean, not so much that it's not going to need us, the French or the Americans or the outside imperialists, but, enough that it's kind of viable. So they had to throw a bunch of other territories in there. And when they did that, they included a significant Sunni population and they included a significant Shia population. And it's the Shia population specifically, which is where we get the Hezbollah dynamic,
Okay.
is what that grows out of. And just sort of fast forward to 1979, it's because over this entire period, Shia had been very marginalized, had felt marginalized, certainly in the post-independence, both the French period and the post-independence period, that they were so eager to be inspired by the Iranian Shia revolution in 1979. So we will get to that. But I think it's worth pointing out that starting in 1943, there were different settlements for this, different dynamics for this. I think the big shift from 1943 to 1990 was that by 1990 things were more equitable, but in 1943 it was something along the lines of the Christians are going to have 55% of the power, and then the Muslim populations, which even then, were half the population, at least, are going to have less of the power. That's the way Lebanon was set up at its outset. But by 1943, there was a recognition that there is a Sunni population that has a right to real power here. But what was interesting is that the Shia, though the Shia did have some representation, specifically in certain ways, generally in the running of the country, the sense that I got from this most recent book that I read on Hezbollah by Arole Daher, the sense that I got was that until the 1970s, the Shia were very subordinate to the Sunni population. The Muslims had representation, but the representation in Lebanon was what the Sunni elites wanted, not, with very little recognition of any other interests by the Shia. So that's like the dynamic that was set up. And it's important to mention that this was never very stable. I'm sort of looking at the history of Lebanon, and it's not really, we're probably in the middle of the longest period of independent sovereignty of Lebanon since 2005. That's it. Like that's the longest period of independent sovereignty Lebanon has ever experienced. And we're 19 years into it, and it's been a horrific catastrophe. After 1943, before the horrific civil war that started in 1975, so there's a 32-year period there, this system where I believe the president is always Christian and the prime minister is always Sunni and the speaker of actually I think the fact that the speaker of the house is always Shia is something that happened much later. But between 1943 and 1975, this was already incredibly chaotic. In 1958, there was actually a U.S. occupation of Lebanon.
Wow.
So that where the U.S. came in and basically reorganized all the power centers and kept everything sort of peaceful. And so if you go from 1943 to 1958, that's 15 years. You go from 1958 to 1975, that's 17 years. And if you go from 2005 to 2024, that's 19 years. So actually, we are in the longest, over the past 19 years, Rory, we've experienced the longest period of actual Lebanese independence ever, and it's not going well.
The World Bank described it as almost the worst economic catastrophe globally since the mid-19th century.
Yes, it is. I guess probably Greece is the only competitor there.
Well, Greece is doing well currently.
Yes, and there is no prospect of getting out of this. I mean, it is a country that is designed to screw over the Ottomans, to screw over the Arabs. And because it just happened to be above the Holy Land, which I think that France liked, I think the Europeans liked, we're going to have this sort of
it's the Crusades again.
Piece of coastline. We're going to we're going to have this piece of coastline above the Holy Land that's going to, even if we don't take the Holy Land, it's going to allow us to exert influence. I guess it's not exactly a historical accident, but it is a bit of a historical irony that this Lebanon, this tool that was sort of designed to screw over Arabs, actually ended up kind of screwing over the Israelis, because it is such a small, such a weak territory, and right up against Israel, there's not a lot of other things that Israel can threaten. If it were a larger country with like larger priorities than what is happening in that sort of armpit of the Mediterranean, then maybe there'd be more of a balance, but Lebanon is just by its nature destabilized by what Israel is trying to do. And that has been the case since 1948. That is,
But are you sort of suggesting that like Lebanon was meant to be like a temporary idea, and then something would have France or something was to come up with an idea later on to finalize it, and it never quite got there? So it's sort of just been stumbling along with other countries popping in every now and again to exert influence.
I think it's a tool that was doing what it was designed to do, and then it got replaced and superseded by a vastly more useful tool, which is Israel. And also, U.S. priorities are different from European priorities. Europeans want out of the Middle East, have been reminded that what they want out of the Middle East is stability and commercial privileges. Lebanon is perfect for that. And that's why I think part of the apocalyptic collapse of Lebanon from, its independence in 1943 until today is a story of U.S. priorities gradually and then very quickly superseding European priorities. The weirdness of Lebanon, the just the spikiness, the strangeness of, well, we've got rich Sunnis, and then we've got rich Christians, and then we've got militias, and it's like well suited to just sort of keep anybody from really having power in Syria, in the Arab world, but it doesn't necessarily have to turn over into chaos. U.S. interest in the Middle East is selling bombs.
Yeah.
As that is U.S. interest in Europe, that is U.S. interest in Asia. It is selling bombs. We don't care, as we've demonstrated at great length over the past couple decades and the past week, we don't care about stability. So Lebanon is a perfect tool of European informal empire that the U.S. has certainly tried to sort of manipulate, but at the end of the day, it's just too complicated and it's too few people. And we've got Israel there who's just, ready to F things up and buy bombs from us. That's what we really care about. And Lebanon has sort of ended up just sort of being this tool that isn't fit for purpose anymore.
One surprising thing is just how weirdly equal the religions are, in the sense that like it's nearly, well, what, 53% Muslim, 40% Christian, but like the Sunni and Shia are 26% each, which is hard to believe, or is that not quite right?
Where are you getting that number?
Wikipedia.
Yes. Okay. So my understanding is that there has not been a legitimate census of Lebanon since like the 1970s or even before that, because the Christians don't want to acknowledge that I think the Christian official position is still that they're 50% of the country or more. That 40% seems a little more accurate or maybe a little too high. And the Sunni do not want to acknowledge that they're getting outbred by the Shia.
Okay.
So very few people other than the Shia have any, and you know what? I think that this author here is a little too there's a great book, but just very sympathetic to the Shia. So I'm noticing this is the last thing I read. So I'm like, well, actually the Shia are the most populous. And you know what? Maybe they're not at all.
So yeah, what is it? LebanonFiles.com is giving those quotes, but you're saying it's very contentious.
It's incredibly contentious. And the idea that the Shia and Sunni population is perfectly equal seems unlikely to me. Seems a little suspicious. Yes.
Yeah.
So the huge problem that made Lebanon, which was already kind of designed to not be viable, but made it dramatically less viable, is 1948 and the establishment of Israel. Of the 750,000 refugees from what Israel was, 100,000 ended up in Lebanon, and they were not. When that happened, there were not 5 million Lebanese. I have not looked at the population in 1948, but that was tremendously destabilizing. And if the Shia were generally poorer folks who tended to have children at higher rates, the Palestinians in their refugee camps in Lebanon took that up to a much, much higher level and were tremendously destabilizing for the Lebanese state. In 1975, key point, Johnny Harris, I think, got this wrong in his YouTube video.
Okay.
Had argued that the Sunni population of Lebanon came as Palestinian refugees, and that's simply not true. There was always, of course, overstates it, but there was a Sunni elite present in Lebanon before the Palestinian refugees. So you had Sunnis at the top, or below the Christians, but at the top of the social structure in Lebanon. And then you had a lot of predominantly Sunni Palestinians, also Christian Palestinians, at the very bottom. That was tremendously destabilizing. And I don't know, Rory, you might be a little too young for this, but
Okay.
like, do you have like cultural or images of Lebanon or Beirut from childhood?
Not really, no.
So for us, for folks of my generation, like Beirut was just always just like the hell of war. Like that's
Yeah.
just what it was. There was a series of comic books, Batman comic books from the 1980s that were actually
Oh,
pretty well known. It was like the Death of Robin storyline. And it was all about like Batman in Beirut and the horrors of civil war, and like the Joker goes and works for Ayatollah Khomeini. It is bat, and I haven't
did
read
it
it in a while
age
now.
well, in your opinion?
I haven't read it in a long time, but it's like that's a sense of just like what the cultural
Yeah, was
significance
at the
of
time.
Beirut was. It was war. It was God, I think, we used to have a drinking game called like beer pong or whatever. And
Hmm.
I think another name for it that was sort of fading by the time I was in college, what people would use was Beirut, because
Oh,
you were just sort of bombing ping pongs
yeah.
into glasses. Like it was, so like Lebanon was war when I was growing up. From 1975 to 1990, it just completely destabilized. The extent to which these factions were not reliable is, I think, an important thing to emphasize. You had Christian factions fighting each other, Sunni factions fighting each other, Druze factions. I feel like this one guy, Walid Jumblat, is I think the just retired finally head of the Druze community, which is a religious sect that is distinct from Islam and Christianity, I
Yes.
believe. This one guy, like, managed to be allied with everybody from the beginning of I think his father was actually killed in the early years of the Civil War, but he just, up until 2023, from the late 70s to 2023, this guy has just been allied
Yeah, I
with
always
absolutely
those people
everybody.
are fascinating how they can sort of survive in such violent places. And everyone seems to like them until they don't.
Well, Lee Jumblat's probably going to die in his bed, which is kind of
Wow.
extraordinary. War was horrific and savage, 1975 to 1990. And in 1982, the Israelis invaded and they just stayed for 18 years.
Did they take any land, or did they eventually give it all back, or?
Well, that's a contentious issue. Hezbollah would maintain that they absolutely did not, and Hezbollah used. But in 2000, in 1982, and I think maybe in another instance, they were pretty much besieging Beirut. Like they had taken over a lot of the country,
Hmm.
and were playing a role in the fight over this, massive commercial city, which is, I guess, more or less in the middle of Lebanon. They did retreat from that a bit, but they held southern Lebanon in partnership with a sort of local proxy force that is now entirely evaporated. They held southern Lebanon for 18 years between 1982 and 2000. The resolution of the Civil War. I've noticed that we're 35 minutes into this and we haven't actually gotten to the formation of Hezbollah. So Hezbollah started in 1982 or thereabouts. Famously, I go back and forth on this. Hezbollah had existed and formed, but didn't really like have the formalization of its
Hmm.
name and whatnot. I think until the mid 80s. But
Okay.
I do think it is fair from recent reading, especially very Hezbollah friendly recent reading, which I've done, that to say that they were responsible for the Marine barracks bombing that killed, I think, over 200 U.S. Marines when the United States attempted to intervene in this civil war, and also a bunch of French
Is this the one
commandos.
that America managed to get revenge on very recently, according to some high-ranking Americans?
Yes, yes, that is absolutely. Jared Kushner wanted to talk about this, so it is worth mentioning. The origins of Hezbollah in the political setup of Lebanon in the 1940s. Christians had a dominant role. Sunni Muslims had a sort of secondary role. And the Shia were just broadly put upon. They were in southern Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley, I think, which is a little more northerly, and in the suburbs of Beirut. They were an underclass, and they certainly had their own, I think it's the Amal movement. They had their own political factions because everybody in Lebanon had their own political factions. But specifically when Israel invaded in 1982 and southern Lebanon became sort of Israel's plaything, the Shia had it emphasized to them that they were not a priority. And that is sort of the window that Hezbollah jumped through and was able to use to become first the premier representative of the Shia population in Lebanon. I believe the Amal movement still exists, but is, I think, and actually fought a war with Hezbollah in the late 1980s. But I think the Amal movement is, to some degree, just sort of votes with Hezbollah all the time now, or what have you. I'm sure there's more complexity to it than that, but Hezbollah is the representative, I think the main representative of the Shia community, and over the course of this century managed to become kind of the main source of power in Lebanon. In 1990, the international community decided that this war should end and conceded to something, specifically the United States conceded to something that is a bit surprising if you know the history of the recent decades. Essentially, the United States just decided to let Syria run the place.
Okay. It's not very American, is
And
it?
this is in the context of the Assad regime, not the current Bashar Assad, but Hafez Assad was emphatically not on our side. By 1990, Egypt had already made peace with Israel. Jordan made peace with Israel, I think, in 1994, but was already sort of on the way. Assad was still very vocally anti-Israel, was in the process of losing their Soviet patron. But Assad was, throughout the Cold War, our enemy. I would argue that's the main reason why we put so much effort into destroying the Syrian government over the past 12 years. Assad was not on our side at that point. But because the Lebanon civil war was acknowledged as like such a nightmare, we were honestly just kind of grateful that somebody wanted to take that on. And we'd already lost the U.S. invasion of Lebanon lasted from August 1982 until February 1984. I think Reagan hung on for about 3 or 4 months after the bombing of the Marine barracks, just to make it look like we weren't scuttling out of there with our tail between our legs, but we absolutely scuttled out of there with our tail between our legs. And 6 years later, we're like, fine, Syria, you want it? Take it. And in the initial agreements, it said that Syria would only be there for 2 years or what have you, but they ended up being there for 15 years. Between 1990 and 2005, Syria, well, honestly, between 1990 and 2000, and this is kind of the crazy thing, Lebanon was simultaneously occupied by Syria and Israel.
Okay.
Which is kind of a crazy thing to think about. Israel was in control of the south, and Syria was, it's interesting. So I was going to characterize it as more lightly in control, but no, they were not lightly in control. Like, they were the main political decider in by far the more wealthy and more powerful part of Lebanon, because of all the affinities that you have between Syria and Lebanon, sort of essentially the same country. Syria, the Assad regime, is a government of a large territory by a religious minority. So while obviously the Assad regime in Syria has very different sets of challenges to Lebanon, like, the way that Lebanon was run made some sense. There were plenty of Christians in the Assad regime's higher reaches. So they were able to work with the Christians, the Sunnis, and because Syria was affiliated with Iran and Hezbollah was very, very affiliated with Iran, this was a period of time where Hezbollah had pretty great freedom of action, no pushback from anybody else in Lebanon. And what Hezbollah successfully did, to the great excitement of not just the Shia, but the entire Arab world, the entire Muslim world, and a lot of just the world in general, between 1990 and 2000, Hezbollah managed to kick Israel out of southern Lebanon. This is an extraordinary accomplishment for a much less powerful militia, and I don't think anybody really disputes that.
Is this something you think people should talk about more, this David and Goliath fight where Lebanon was able to survive?
I'm not. Did Lebanon survive?
It's still there.
It's still there. I think what Hezbollah managed to pull off here was incredibly impressive and is worth talking about. I think it gets talked about in Washington, D.C., or but it's talked about in this incredibly pejorative sense as this terrorist victory. And it's like, well, actually, no, it's an indigenous resistance group. An indigenous resistance group primarily made up of the poorest people in that country that kicked out Israel, heavily armed, heavily supported by the wealthiest and most powerful country in human history. Like, it's an extraordinary story. And yeah, people should probably talk about it a little bit more. However, Hezbollah managed to sort of delegitimize its own victory. In 2000, nobody in the Lebanese, and to be clear, throughout this period, like the Lebanese power structure did not like Hezbollah because these are a bunch of elite Sunnis and Christians, and I think the phrase that kept coming up in this book was, the Shia is supposed to shine our shoes, like that is not, they never liked this, but they didn't really have much of a choice because Syria was sort of the main decision point here, and Syria and Iran were aligned, and Syria and Iran were anti-Israel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In 2000, this incredible victory is won, and Hezbollah made a decision that's very similar to the decision that the Houthis made very recently after defeating Saudi Arabia. They realized that a lot of their legitimacy came from being the resistance movement, fighting against. And I think there is a village on the border that Israel never let go of. There are some, or at least there were some Lebanese and Hezbollah prisoners still in Israeli jails. And then there's specifically the Sheba Farms, which I think most people agree was actually part of Syria. But Hezbollah, I'm sure among other Lebanese, decided it was actually occupied Lebanese territory that the Israelis were occupying. So their fight had to go on. So essentially they won an extraordinary, historic, almost universally recognized victory against Israel, and then decided to keep fighting over minor details. And I think this is something that, it's funny, this most recent book doesn't give them a hard time for that, but I think it is just a stupid choice that Hezbollah made, and a sad choice, because had Hezbollah been willing to
do the boring thing.
Yeah, exactly. Do the boring thing, declare victory, give up their weapons. Like, Israel kind of would have been out of luck, as we say. Like, they wouldn't have a fight to justify all the horrible things they've since done to Lebanon and Gaza. And in the context of like that 2000 period, like it actually would have been, Israel would have had a lot of difficulty. I mean, who knows? 9/11 happened a bit later, which Hezbollah had absolutely nothing to do with. In fact, Hezbollah fought against al-Qaeda for most of the past decade. Yeah, so who knows? Maybe the Hezbollah folks are right, and it was important to maintain this resistance, even though they'd already won. I don't know. I think my take is that Hezbollah really screwed up and allowed itself to, I think, be fairly portrayed as a continued sort of outside occupation of Lebanon. In their inspiration, in their founding documents, they talk about their loyalty to the supreme leader of Iran. I mean, crucially, not the government of Iran, but the supreme leader and his spiritual leadership. But they didn't, like, they could have just had that be the case. They didn't have to continue this conflict. By continuing this conflict, by subjecting Lebanon to large-scale Israeli attacks over and over again, I think they have made the critique more real that they are more a tool of Iranian policy than they are working for the benefit of the Lebanese. And I think that's a tension, that's a critique that Hezbollah is always trying to work against, but this choice to sort of continue the conflict, sort of, you can argue that in 2000, Lebanon managed to liberate itself from the Israelis. Hezbollah did that work. In 2005, through a protest movement, it was called the Cedar Revolution. I remember the images. I remember how excited everybody was supposed to be about that. They managed to kick out Syria. And you can argue, once Syria was kicked out, that the main force of external imperial influence in Lebanon was Hezbollah, was the Iranian influence. And like the next step should have been Hezbollah sort of freeing itself from Iran a bit, and then Lebanon really could have moved forward to a degree.
Is this some of like the only money coming into Lebanon? And you talk about this being an underclass. Does it not make sense to them to keep themselves in this unique situation where they're semi-freedom fighters, but never really fully being a legitimate government?
Well, they are fully in legitimate government, or at least they have had periods when that has been the case. the current state of Lebanon's government as it has, but I don't think they've had a president for 2 years. It's sort of complete disarray. And yeah, you can make that argument, Hezbollah, because of Iranian money that I expect is now about to dry up, has had some, freedom of action and freedom of influence. And crucially, it is not the only source of money coming into Lebanon. It would be, I think it is actually what I just said is quite unfair because every other faction in Lebanon is very much in the pay of the United States of America. The Saudis have dumped a lot of money in as well. So I think Hezbollah would have a good argument to say, well, look, like the Saudis, the Christians, everybody else has all this Saudi money, all this US money, all this other money. Like, why should we feel bad about taking money from Iran? I think my answer to that, the reason you should feel bad about taking that money is because that money is associated to a policy of picking fights with Israel. There is no question. I think there is more of a question about in the aftermath of October 7th, whether Hezbollah really was the main aggressor and actor here. That's certainly the narrative in the United States. But if you actually look at the volume of people that were being killed, the volume of weapons that were being thrown about, it sure seems like Israel was sending a lot more weapons and killing a lot more Lebanese over the past year, even before things escalated. But in 2006, there's not actually a question. In 2006, Hezbollah started it. Hezbollah decided to abduct a bunch of Israeli soldiers. Israel's reaction was outsized and extraordinarily brutal. Massive bombings up and down the country, killing 1,000 people. But still, like Hezbollah decided to kidnap some Israeli soldiers on the border. Like that's like they started it. And there's a great quote that shows up everywhere of Nasrallah being like Hassan Nasrallah, the guy who was killed, but who was the charismatic leader of Hezbollah from the 1990s until he was killed this fall. There's a quote from him saying like, yeah, if I'd known Israel was going to do that, I would not have done that. It's quite straightforward.
Wow.
And who knows if he were alive to talk, maybe he'd say the same about how Hezbollah acted in the aftermath of October 7th. The key connection here that perhaps we've been neglecting is that Hezbollah certainly lost a lot of affection in Washington, D.C. after 2000 when it decided to continue the fight after they'd won. But it actually didn't lose its European support and affection or Arab world support or affection until the Syrian civil war. Their choice to continue to working for Assad and to prop up Assad lost it an immense amount of respect in the Arab world. Assad is, I would certainly agree with Hezbollah and Iran that Assad had been a victim of U.S. imperialism to some extent, but he's also an incredibly brutal, nightmarish dictator coming from a religious minority, repressing the majority of Syria. Even Hamas had a big falling out with Hezbollah because Hamas supported the revolution against Assad, whereas Hezbollah did not. Interestingly, Hezbollah was not declared a terrorist organization by the European Union until the Syrian civil war. Supposedly, the motivating factor for this was a terrorist attack that was carried out in Bulgaria that I believe Hezbollah still denies responsibility for.
Okay.
But I think the context in which that happened was Hezbollah supporting the Assad regime. That is what convinced all of the members of the European Union to unanimously vote to call Hezbollah a terrorist organization. And that is just an interesting turnaround. That Lebanon, this country that was sort of designed by Europeans to help control Arabs, was sort of turned around by Iran to create a force that worked against U.S. and European interests by propping up Assad for as long as it did. Hezbollah is it's a weird organization, Rory. Like, I think it is fair to some extent to call them terrorists. Are they terrorists anywhere near on the level of Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State or the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham organization that is taking over Syria as we speak? Absolutely not. They're just not. Like, I think HTS has enough probably Turkish resources that they're not using suicide bombings as like their main weapon of warfare anymore. But that certainly, there were phases with HTS under its current leadership where they suicide bombings were their main mode of warfare. Hezbollah in the 1980s definitely used suicide bombings a couple times, but it's been a long time. Like they're like a military organization. So yeah, like I think Hezbollah accomplished miraculous, heroic things, and then spent the past 2 decades frittering away that goodwill and becoming, frankly, just another kind of nasty political actor in the Middle East. So it's interesting. The question is, what happens now? By the time this is published, Syria could be Damascus. I think it's unlikely, but I've been surprised by every
Yeah.
step of progress that HTS has made. But Damascus and Syria in general could be in the control of HTS by the time this is published. And if that's the case, then Hezbollah no longer has its direct line to Iran. Where are they going to get their weapons from? Where are they going to get their money from? Is Hezbollah doomed? I would be surprised. Hezbollah lost all of its leadership and a lot of its weapons and still managed to keep Israel from, making it more than, it seems like 200 yards into Lebanon. But it is a very different era for Hezbollah that is dawning. It is a very different era for Lebanon that is dawning. Well, it's all very interesting, Rory, I suppose.
What would you like to see happen with Lebanon? Like, what could you do? Because the politics is incredibly complicated. It seems like it moves incredibly slowly. The lack of movement and dynamism was symbolized with that explosion in 2021. Like, what would you push for? What would you like to see?
Obviously, I'd love to see a happy, independent, prosperous Lebanon, but I don't believe that's possible.
Oh.
We did a really deep dive on Lebanon a year or two back, went to one of these Exchange Foundation, I think a couple of these Exchange Foundation, 2-week-long classes, essentially trying to learn about Lebanon, read a number of books. And my conclusion at the end of it was, I have nothing positive to say about Lebanon.
Wow.
I think it was designed to fail. It was designed to screw over Arabs, the Arab world more broadly. And I think Lebanon should probably be absorbed by Syria, though, of course, at this point, that would mean being absorbed by Al-Qaeda. So
maybe
not
not
a good thing. Yeah. Maybe not. I'm not optimistic about Lebanon. Beautiful place, incredible place to party. But just not.
So does this feel like a sort of a European experiment that needs to come to an end and go back to what you would describe as its default form?
I can't recommend the end of a nation. That is not in my philosophical makeup. But I think the best way to put it, Rory, is I have no answers on Lebanon, and I don't think anybody around Lebanon has any answers. And Hezbollah clearly doesn't have the answers. And all Hezbollah really has to offer is more bombing from Israel at this point. So, yeah, I don't know. Kind of a grim episode, but
yes. But I think it was hard to not imagine it would be with such a title and a subject.
Yeah, but I think it is. I think it's important to understand what Lebanon is, because I think there's a lot of just that, wasn't Lebanon happy, when it was owned by the French or whatever. And I think there's a lot of myth making about Lebanon or some vanished golden age of Lebanon. I mean, don't get me wrong. Obviously, the Lebanese were happier before the 2019 financial crisis when all their savings disappeared. But it is a country that is very faulty in its initiation and its execution. And I think what Lebanon needs to be at peace is a region that is at peace. But Lebanon is always going to function to make it harder to have a region at peace. So that's sort of a grim catch-22 there.
Well, we wish Lebanon all the best, but we have no power over that in any way whatsoever. No. So
None.
Let's just hope everything ends up well, but it probably won't by the time this goes out.
No.
So long.
Yep.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire: What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.